So, hello everyone, thanks for joining today. My name is Tom Gold, I'm Associate Director at WSP. I'm presenting today with my colleagues Alex Thomas, Liv Cairns and Liv Rayner. So we're all transport decarbonisation specialists at WSP. We work day to day on embedding carbon in transport planning and design, including analytical and advisory work across both transport strategy and scheme development. And this is something we do in very close collaboration with colleagues across WSP, whether that's transport planners, modelers, designers, environmentalists, and more. So we want to share with you today our knowledge and innovation of best practice in transport decarbonisation from the perspective of the UK. So firstly, in terms of what we're going to cover, I'm going to set the scene a bit, the context, before handing over to my colleague Alex to run through the carbon innovation that's informing transport strategy. Liv Cairns is then going to share approaches for embedding carbon management in organisations, programmes and schemes, before Liv Rayner covers quantitative tools for whole life carbon assessment. And then we've got a bit of time where I'll wrap up at the end and then hopefully leave at least 10 minutes for Q&A before we finish. So we'll jump straight into it. So firstly, as I say, just kind of setting the policy context a bit. So for those of you who might not be based in the UK, I guess just as a kind of overview of the commitments we've made, generally, the UK is we think world leading in many ways in terms of its commitment to decarbonising. Carbon budgets and net zero by 2050 are written into our law and require rapid reductions in emissions. And this commitment also has been cascaded down to local authorities, with over 300 declaring climate emergencies and some committing to net zero as early as 2030. And so far, the UK economy has reduced emissions significantly since 1990, largely due to deindustrialisation and the phase out of coal. But transport emissions, which is what we're here to talk about today, has remained relatively static over that period, however, and transport remains the UK's largest source of emissions, as you can, big part of emissions, and you can see the track of it in terms of carbon budgets and the scale of ambition that's needed as per this graph from the Climate Change Committee. So action is being taken in recognition of the scale of the challenge. So the government, for example, has recognised the importance of considering carbon when making funding and consenting decisions. So their business case guidance and policy for major schemes requires best practice whole life carbon assessment and management. And this is an area which particularly, the four of us have been working in and seen huge progress over the last few years, which is something Liv and Liv particularly are going to come on to later. We've also seen a lot of progress around electric vehicles and switch in terms of technology in our vehicle fleet. So the UK has now legislated the zero emission vehicle mandate that sets sales targets on cars and vans for vehicle manufacturers. And new petrol and diesel cars and vans will not be sold in the UK after 2030, with hybrids facing that ban in 2035. So we're a long way off a country like Norway, but the policy that we do have is really driving change now. So electric vehicles, which here in the UK are indicated by green number plates. They're now pretty commonplace on our roads. And while there is some uncertainty over exactly how quickly the vehicles on our roads will switch to electric vehicles, the government's independent advisors on climate change, the Climate Change Committee, suggest that about half of the car fleet will be electric in the early 2030s and near 100% in 2050. Heavy goods vehicles are a little more challenging, and we don't yet have the legislation there in place to drive that, but the Climate Change Committee suggests this transition to zero emission HGVs can be achieved with battery electric technology, and the government does plan at least to ban the sale of all diesel HGVs by 2040. And we are now seeing this have an impact. So UK transport emissions are now falling thanks to largely to electric vehicles. And as indicated by the purple line on this graph from the Climate Change Committee, some drastic ongoing reductions are now needed if we're to achieve net zero by 2050. And the switch to electric vehicles will do most of this, but the technology transition has to outpace what the government has legislated for in the zero emission vehicle mandate. And there are some risks and downsides to just swapping fossil fuel vehicles for electric. So mode shift plays a really important role in decarbonising transport. So the Climate Change Committee suggests about 7% of car demand should be switched to active and public transport by 2035. But we face quite a few headwinds here in the UK to these reductions. So for example, mode shift is going to be made more difficult as more people own electric vehicles that are cheaper to drive. And it's also become quite politically difficult to do anything that's perceived as impacting drivers. And we've also, across all of this, we can't forget the carbon impact presented by construction and maintenance, which transport is a major contributor to. So unless we decarbonise those construction and maintenance processes, and we are looking to build more, there's electric vehicle charging infrastructure, cycle lanes, or otherwise, unless we decarbonise those processes, the economy as a whole isn't going to reach net zero. And those headwinds can lead to a temptation just to kind of let technology do the work in decarbonising transport and avoid tackling any questions of travel behaviour or demand. But a more balanced pathway that takes steps to influence travel demand is more likely to succeed in decarbonising in line with our targets. So petrol and diesel vehicles are going to remain a large proportion of the vehicles on our roads well into the 2030s. So taking steps to reduce those car kilometres driven by those petrol and diesel vehicles is going to help us reduce emissions in these really critical decades. But it can also help us achieve some really significant co-benefits, such as those shown on screen. And there are some really good examples of this in the UK. For example, the ultra low emission zone in London, that's led to a really substantial improvement in air quality, or there's some road space reallocation in Leeds, which the city I'm based in, really has made the city centre a much more attractive place to visit and work, with obviously economic and social benefits to that. So a balanced pathway that includes these kind of interventions is going to be more equitable, more efficient, and a more resilient transition. Cars are expensive, and a transport system without good alternatives is vulnerable to disruption, such as from extreme weather events. And we are likely to see more and more disruption from climate change if we fail to mitigate our emissions. So a rapid and balanced pathway of transport decarbonisation, I think we'll agree, is the right way to go. But there's a lot of nuance, and there's no one-size-fits-all approach to this, meaning decision makers need good evidence. And that is particularly true in transport strategy, which is a really early and influential stage of transport planning. And on that note, over to my colleague, Alex.
Thanks, Tom. So if you go to next slide, please. So a bit of context to set the scene. A consideration of carbon and local transport strategy started in the UK in 2019, when the Transport Decarbonisation Plan made a commitment for quantifiable carbon reduction evidence to be a fundamental part of local transport planning and funding moving forward. But like many countries, until recently, there's always been a gap in evidence and understanding to make this a reality. So in response, WSP and the Net Zero team here has supported regional transport bodies in developing tools and processes to make carbon reduction accessible at a local level, while simultaneously supporting the DFT in drafting the guidance which underpins this. The chapter I'm going to discuss today will go through the innovations in quantification and forecasting, which seek to future-proof local transport strategy against transport decarbonisation. As Tom mentioned, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to transport decarbonisation. So to help contextualise this challenge, we've adopted what we call a golden thread. This links international agreements to national commitments alongside the role of local and regional transport strategy in meeting these targets. At a local level, it's clear the authorities need an evidence-led approach to achieving the net zero vision, and that starts by understanding, firstly, how quickly emissions need to fall, the best mix of transport outcomes that can help realise that, and then the specific interventions that will achieve those outcomes. In developing an evidence base at the earliest opportunities, authorities now have the capacity to track and monitor the impact of local transport decision making, enabling a vision and validate approach to scheme delivery moving forward. Against the golden thread, this four-step process has been developed to embed carbon quantification into strategy development. And at strategic level, it's first recommended that authorities start by building a baseline evidence to understand the scale of the challenge at hand. The baseline will identify the key sources of emissions and quantify how they change up to 2050 under different scenarios. The difference between the baseline forecast and the decarbonisation pathway will then inform the scale of the local emissions gap and how that contributes to the national commitment. Secondly, an authority should set their vision and objectives, and this largely avoids authorities signing up to declarations which aren't politically or pilotably deliverable. In the UK, we've seen a number of authorities declare net zero targets well in advance of national commitments, and now, since the tools have become available, since the insights in in-house capabilities has grown, they're now looking to recalibrate those targets to ensure a more vision and validate approach. Steps 3 and 4 are around quantifying the user emissions impact of schemes, which are proposed as part of the strategy, ensuring that the impact of the programme aligns with that vision established, And if it doesn't, then it gives you an evidence base which you can lobby for further support and investment. To plug the gap in tools and evidence, a carbon evidence playbook has been developed. This digital tool is the first of its kind. It enables each authority in England and Wales to collate evidence against each of the 4 steps previously outlined. The tool contains a Power BI dashboard, which covers the first 2 steps, as well as an online quantification tool known as the Policy Builder. The following few slides will take you through the technical capabilities of each of these tools, while showcasing the value of an evidence-led approach to informing decision-making here in the UK. I think lots of this will be relatable and transferable to elsewhere. So starting with the Power BI dashboard, this baseline tool allows each authority to integrate their carbon evidence base, enabling a place-based approach to transport decarbonisation. So at the top left, you have a page designed to understand the variables which influence how emissions change up to 2050, which dictates the pace of change, and the difference between a local and a transport decarbonisation pathway. Moving clockwise, you can then understand at a very disaggregate level the main sources of emissions, which presents both issues and opportunities, and how you can tailor that specifically to inform the types of schemes you should be aspiring to deliver. Transport outcomes is making sure that the policy objectives within a strategy are aligned to the scale of ambition required, and making sure that there's a clear understanding of the scale of change required. And then without all strategy development here in the UK, there's a real place-based focus. So making sure that the spatial differences and transport decarbonisation challenges are recognised and considered throughout the development of a transport strategy. Next slide, please, Tom. So rather than viewing emissions at a very aggregate level, as was previously the case with the greenhouse gas inventories, the digital tool now has the functionality to identify specific segments of demand, highlighting the key sources and issues and opportunities for the strategy to seek to address. So using a standardized methodology, each authority now has the in-house capability to understand their profile at a very detailed and granular level. This page gives an overview of some of the key metrics which can be obtained. So you can really view and dynamically test the interdependencies between different trips on the network. For example, emissions by vehicle type, trip length, origin destination, place type, journey purpose, and road type. These insights can be used to inform the objectives of the strategy, whilst identifying some of the main challenges to achieving those local targets. Lots of myth busting involved with this, lots of stakeholder engagement, and real value from having visual interpretation of the specific emissions profile. Next, the Power BI module has a page which has what we call emission levers built in, and these allow the user to test the hypothetical carbon return on achieving different transport outcomes locally. In total, there are around 20 levers spread across the Avoid Shift Improve framework, and the user can aggregate different outcomes to validate the scale of change required to achieve different levels of carbon reduction. So very strategic tool. It gives an understanding of the lifting power of different policy objectives, whether that be mode shift, electrification, or trip avoidance, and it can really debunk I guess where the main priorities in a strategy should be. Next slide, please, Tom. And then finally, for steps 3 and 4 of the guidance, which involve quantifying the user emissions impact of specific interventions, the Policy Builder tool has been developed. This tool allows users to select an intervention from a drop-down of 30 different thematic types to benchmark the impact of delivering that schema locally. So the user can then select the location in which the scheme is proposed, and the year in which the scheme will be delivered, and scope and intensity settings to tailor the impact of that scheme to the specifics against the benchmark. Once inputted, the impact of the scheme will be mapped against the baseline forecast, and you can use it to identify the impact of the scheme against the residual slice of the baseline, as I previously went through. Similar to the levers, the schemes can be tested in isolation or at a program level, and it allows the user to understand the intensity and scale of interventions which are required to close the emissions gap. It's highly unlikely and not expected that local transport action plans will close the gap entirely. Hence, this tool will allow dynamic testing to answer the question, what it takes. The evidence from that answer can be used to build consensus around future business cases and to target future funding opportunities. Similar to the policy builder, an infrastructure carbon benchmarking tool is also being developed to support a proportionate whole life carbon assessment of schemes at the earliest opportunity. This ensures decision makers are aware of the carbon impact of delivering and maintaining schemes. Next slide, please, Tom. The principles of the Golden Thread and local transport plan guidance are now being adopted within spatial planning to ensure future development embeds a consideration of carbon throughout. WSP has developed a digital spatial planning tool which enables the user to test the impact of different quantums and distributions of housing growth on transport emissions. This informs the scale of influence of housing commitments and highlights the need for growth to come forward in sustainable locations. The same type of quantification and scenario testing can be applied across spatial development strategies. And history tells us it's very difficult to retrofit desired travel behaviours once the site has been developed. So integrated land use planning offers a unique opportunity to achieve significant carbon savings. And then finally, the last slide for me, touching on our capability to model and forecast changes in electric vehicle uptake. We have a tool which reflects a localized forecast, which we can compare against national scenarios. And this can be used to really tailor and prioritize future provision of charge points, but also understand how electrification at a strategic level can influence transport decarbonisation moving forward.
Great, thanks, Alex. So as well as embedding carbon management into transport strategy, it's really important that we consider carbon in scheme development. And for any given scheme, we're dealing with decisions throughout planning and the design stages that can have a really significant influence on the carbon emissions overall. And as Tom alluded to earlier, if we continue with a kind of business as usual attitude, so the same activities of business as usual thinking, we risk eroding any kind of carbon reduction savings that we're getting through the scheme. And we also, we focus on the user emissions of the scheme too, and we can counteract those savings that we can achieve through measures like EV uptake and mode shift if we're not thinking about the resources and reducing the resources that we're putting into some of these schemes and minimizing the emissions associated with that too. And that's all if we're going to achieve net zero. We need to be thinking about both sides of that. So if you're an authority and you're responsible for, say, part of the transport network, we're thinking about what are the constituent parts of the puzzle that we need to decarbonise. So in our experience, we've tried to assimilate that onto the slide here, and there are clear decarbonisation commitments that are needed, decarbonisation strategy we feel is needed, a carbon management process with supplementary guidance, governance and training. Some of these puzzle pieces are really well developed in the UK, so particularly at like national and regional local level, most local authorities have decarbonisation commitments, or they can defer to national targets. But actually, there's also a lot of good work that goes on at a national and a regional level when it comes to like benefiting the local authorities too. So the DFT, the Department for Transport, has developed carbon quantification tools and guidance, and they've got specific carbon management plan templates that local authorities then don't need to develop their own, and they can use those as standardized and consistent. And each place, though, we're finding, each place and local authority has their own unique circumstances and they have their own challenges. And so for some of these listed on the left, there's no one size fits all. And actually that's particularly true for, say, a carbon management process and for the training and the governance. While PAS 2080 provides the kind of core principles and process, it is quite high level and it's also not necessarily cross-sector. So it can make it really difficult for local authorities on the ground to just understand how they can apply it to transport specifically and in their own context of their own governance processes as well. Next slide, thank you. But a leading example of this and delivering on this challenge is National Highways. There are authority in the UK here responsible for the strategic road network. National Highways is a really ambitious decarbonisation commitments, and they've translated that into their own net zero plan. That's aligned to the Paris Agreement and the principles of science-based targets. And off the back of that, they've then launched their own PAS 2080 verified carbon management system. They've published various net zero roadmaps for concrete, for steel, for asphalt. They've improved their carbon data capture methods, and they've launched a low carbon opportunities register to try and quantify some of those reductions amongst many, many other things. We've been working with various different local authorities to try and produce a carbon management advice note or some kind of document that collates and distills key carbon management standards and guidance, so including PAS 2080, providing a bit more tailored advice on the activities that should be undertaken as part of the development of both transport infrastructure improvement projects or asset maintenance projects and schemes. And so typically this would apply to all capital and revenue funded highway works that are perhaps delivered by the council. And we want to sort of note here that it's important that producing our outputs, it relies on existing deliverables that have already been completed and work completed by other technical disciplines that are often involved within these schemes. So it can all be integrated together and is complementary to existing process. So this figure on the slide here is from PAS 2080, but it just shows that a PAS 2080 aligned carbon management process, it can be nested into the design life cycle already. So we've pulled out a few elements here, but you could apply that at each stage, for example, drawing on the cost estimates in the bill of quantities for carbon quantification. Liv's going to come on to that in the next section, but that feeds directly into some of the tools that we have, or liaising with design engineers through carbon management workshops, or implementing carbon leadership with the project manager or the project director. That all works alongside the existing wider team. And finally, we just wanted to, this session and the slides have been very presented primarily on climate mitigation, so carbon reduction, but climate resilience is also a key, crucial aspect here as part of the climate emergency, and climate risks and adaptation, so preparing for flooding or extreme heat, they can also influence carbon emissions. So if that's for a new scheme and you're thinking about procuring materials which can withstand temperature fluctuation, or the impact of severe weather increasing or generating the need for more frequent maintenance, to embed climate resilience alongside existing processes, you could also integrate that to the carbon management workshop, and relevant design team members are already all joining together to discuss that design. So this is a fundamental component, but also the carbon management process, a key part of that is assessment. And so now I'm going to hand over to Liv, who can talk us through how quantification is completed practically.
So this slide is just basically to demonstrate that understanding the full impact of transport projects means understanding their whole life carbon emissions. So this is primarily made up of user emissions and infrastructure carbon, capital and operational. And to quantify these, there's different methodologies that must be used. Fortunately, as Liv was referenced previously, many of the inputs required draw on existing data sets within standard project workflows, so cost estimation, modelling, demand forecasting. And either as WSP or with our clients, we've developed tools that calculate a full range of these carbon impact associated with transport schemes. Central to this is our carbon zero framework, which consolidates results from all these calculations into a format that's efficient, consistent, and transparent. This enables us to clearly report and communicate the whole life carbon impacts of any project to inform decision making. Quantification allows us more generally to understand where the emissions are coming from and then target reduction measures to where they'll have the majority of the impact. The next slide is focused on user emissions, which are an important component of the whole story, particularly for schemes that influence general traffic flows or modal shift. Estimating these emissions typically involves processing large data sets from traffic modelling that are underpinned by a whole range of assumptions that we need to understand. This data often is already available, and converting it into meaningful carbon estimates can be complex and time consuming. There's a variety of tools and methodologies that can be used to quantify user emissions, which will result in inconsistent outputs and they're difficult to compare across projects. To address this, we've invested in our own research and development and work closely with our clients to improve the robustness and efficiency of these methods. This includes using things such as Python scripting to automate calculations, reduce manual effort, and minimize human error. But also, it means developing new tools that standardize the calculation processes, enabling more transparent and more reliable outputs that support informed, comparable decision making. The next slide is the other half of the story, so infrastructure carbon. So high quality calculations of capital and operational carbon are essential for effective carbon management. They must be both accurate and detailed to help identify carbon hotspots and inform meaningful reduction strategies. The reliability of these calculations is dependent on the quality and relevance of the background data sets. So these are things that we all need, the carbon factors, assumptions, methodologies, but also they're based on the granularity of scheme-specific data, so material quantities, specifications, activities profiles. We've aligned our approach internally to the latest industry standards, so things like RICS, Whole Life Carbon Assessment, and the BS-EN 1747. This ensures consistency and credibility in the outputs in which we produce. While there's a range of capital carbon calculators available, some spreadsheet-based, some digital, we've developed bespoke tools internally and approaches to make these calculations more efficient and be better integrated into the project workflows. Our tools not only support robust quantification, but also enable tracking across project life cycles. This helps teams to embed carbon thinking from the early stages of design through to delivery and measure progress against the targets, which we've gone throughout. The final slide is on reporting. So one of the key challenges in carbon assessment is the fragmentation of data, with individual assessments often siloed and difficult to compare. By reporting carbon assessments in a consistent format, we can integrate them into tools like Power BI, as shown here, enabling strategic level analysis across programs, clients, and geographies. While this aggregation allows us to identify trends, reoccurring hotspots, and systematic inefficiencies, and also this then leads to informed decision making at a program and authority level, rather than treating each scheme in isolation. We developed interactive dashboards for our clients that bring together carbon assessment outputs and make it easier for stakeholders to understand and compare the results. This reporting approach also helps us create a database and helps reduce duplication. Data from one scheme can be used to inform others, especially during the early stages and when the project development is at the very beginning, where schemes have similar contexts that can be applied. This helps improve efficiency and supports continuous improvement in carbon modelling practices. Looking ahead, as we continue to structure and standardise whole life carbon assessments, there's significant potential for tools such as AI to enhance insights. But I'll hand over to Tom now to reflect on what we've done and where we're going next.
Thanks, Liv. Yeah, just so to wrap up really briefly, hopefully, we've given the impression today, as we think there's a lot of good progress in the UK. So government has adopted policy and legislation to decarbonise transport, as I touched upon. So things like the zero emission vehicle mandate, the requirement to consider carbon in business cases and consenting. And, again, as hopefully we've showed, the sector has responded to this, often as a collaboration between public and private sectors. So whether that's new approaches, such as those that Alex and Liv Cairns have taken us through, innovative tools, such as Liv has just touched on, but also, as demonstrated today, things like knowledge sharing and continual improvement. So this progress, we think, leaves us in a much better position to understand where carbon comes from and what we can do about it. But truthfully, we can't pretend we're on track yet. We're not yet on that glide path to achieving the emission reductions needed for carbon budgets and net zero. Further intervention is definitely going to be needed. And this means that a new business as usual is required for transport planning and design that applies best practice at scale, not just on those big major projects. And to do this, as Liv touched on, we need to make carbon an embedded part of organisational culture and governance. And we also need to help decision makers make the case for carbon reduction measures through clear carbon analysis and reporting that also highlights the co-benefits of taking action. And again, we've also got to think beyond carbon as well. So bringing adaptation and nature to the forefront in an integrated way alongside carbon, while keeping learning all the time through evaluation and improving our evidence bases. So, what works and feeding that back up into early strategy and scheme development decisions. So thanks very much for your attention today. Please do reach out. I'll put mine and Alex's emails on the slide. If there's anything of interest or you want to discuss, equally, there's anything you think the experience is a bit different where you're, in your areas, we'd really appreciate hearing about that. Equally, any other innovation that we might not have covered today, it'd be great to hear about that. We have got time for questions, so just check the Q&A. So I guess one question we've had through was, how does the approach differ between devolved administrations? Because obviously the UK, while carbon budgets may sit at a UK level, we have devolved administrations such as Wales and Scotland, and the approach does vary between those. So if Ken, you're probably the right place to answer that question, particularly in the Welsh context.
Yeah, we found that quite interesting. I mentioned earlier about the Department for Transport setting out like key carbon management templates and guidance, and whilst we can draw on that as best practice when we develop schemes in Wales, we also have our own unique set of policies in terms of roads review, going through the WEL tags, so the Welsh Transport Appraisal Guidance process instead. And there's a completely different focus in terms of being on well-being and the integrated well-being appraisal at what's the equivalent of full business case. So responding to those challenges in an ambitious policy context, but also not having the same level of guidance set out to follow has been an interesting one for us to feel our way through. But I think that it'd be interesting to know if that's the same in other European countries or even more widely. That must be a challenge that isn't unique to Wales, that they're grappling with both sides of the coin.
Brilliant. Thanks, Liv. And I think everywhere across the world is doing transport decarbonisation slightly differently, and I think there's hopefully events like this, and we're also keen to hear from people. There is good practice, really keen to learn from, whether that's in Europe and some of the approaches been taken to mode shift there and what you can see on the ground in some of European cities, or as Liv touched on, there's some really bold policy that we've seen in Wales, which is quite different to what we've seen in England, which is perhaps quite strong on the analytical side. Great, thanks, Liv. So we also had a question through about spatial plans. So Alex, I think you touched on this really briefly, but obviously housing's quite a big issue and priority for the government here in the UK. So I would just ask kind of how that's being considered, how is carbon being considered in the development of spatial plans, whether that's just something you could expand on briefly.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I think, very relevant to the UK, but a global challenge really in terms of accommodating growth. In the UK, in terms of growth in vehicle demand, we're seeing 1 to 2% annually, and in terms of where the location of development is placed, there's a real correlation between that and the types of travel patterns which that site brings forward. So what we're looking to do is replicate what we've done with local transport policy and strategy and deliver that and embed that to spatial planning. So understanding which sites can yield the lowest vehicle trip rates, and very much moving away from the historical process in the UK, which was build a strategic traffic model, load in the development sites, and then predict and provide. So predict how much demand is going to be generated from that site, and then consider what types of improvements to the infrastructure will be required to mitigate the highway and safety impact of the site. We're very much looking to establish a vision and validate approach, which considers carbon as part of that. So looking at where people can travel and by which mode, and then trying to create better places for people. So using carbon as a driver to deliver the types of places in future which we're all aspiring towards. And I think through carbon as a specific lens, we have an opportunity to revisit what integrated land use planning is trying to do for the past sort of 20 or 30 years. So quite an exciting space to work in terms of the optics and the analytical frameworks which are evolving. And we have a spatial planning tool which I didn't get a chance to go through in detail, but that is really powerful in terms of understanding at strategic level how the accessibility and connectivity of a location can follow through into the types of travel behavior you're going to get from that site, and then that should validate how many dwellings can be delivered in that location and what you would need to do to make that site sustainable if you were to add more housing to that location. So yeah, I'm sure lots of people grappling with the same challenge. In the UK, planning policy hasn't quite caught up, but as a strategic priority for the country, I think we have a real onus and opportunity as an industry to influence that.
Great, thanks, Alex. So we have another question through. Are there guiding recommendations for the maintenance and upkeep of public zero-emission vehicles like buses? And I'll admit, I guess the space we're operating in, the four of us, is less on the detail of zero-emission vehicles and, for example, their maintenance. So probably not the ones qualified to give you an answer on that today. But please do reach out by all means, and I'll put you in touch with a colleague. But it is a fundamental part of decarbonising. I think hopefully the slide I shared earlier touched on. We will not get to net zero transport without technology. It's not to say that's the full part of the picture. And I think it's an important question around the maintenance and the upkeep. We need to look beyond just the initial investment, but the costs and sometimes the embodied carbon as well, both the vehicles and infrastructure, which is an ongoing impact. So yeah, please do reach out if I can elaborate on that. We'll put you in touch with colleagues. Please do send through any further questions. We've got a few more minutes. I think just one more that we've had was around benchmarks. So yeah, what is a benchmark and how are they derived, and how can they be used to support early stage transport planning decisions? So I know Alex, you touched on this, but I know Liv, Rainer, you're a bit more involved in benchmarks. So whether you could just give us a quick summary of how infrastructure carbon benchmarks are being used in early stages to support decision making.
Yeah, so Alex is obviously better talk about the user emissions side of benchmarks, but from an infrastructure perspective, we've been working on tools to develop benchmarks for early stage quantification of transport schemes with different clients across the UK. So we have developed benchmarks for different local transport schemes, including generally cycle lanes, carriageways, highways, split into different categories of local road, primary road. And the way in which we've been doing that is by providing people with a whole range of benchmarks which can be used in each category and letting them decide for themselves how likely their scheme is to match one of those benchmarks or fall somewhere in between in that instance. So we use something called a carbon intensity lever to determine where your scheme falls on, say, the highest carbon impact type of scheme and the lowest carbon impact for that type of scheme. It gives you information on specifications, hotspots, things like that can help you inform that decision. But generally, the tool and the benchmarks are used to determine what's the right type of scheme to be used, as well as when you get into the early stages and you've chosen what type of scheme within those intervention types. So is it a step cycle lane? Is it a light segregated? Obviously, it depends on the use case and what you're trying to achieve in terms of user emissions, and what other guidance is around that. But yeah, we've got infrastructure carbon benchmarks now to kind of give us an answer at the early stages, which we didn't have before you have a BOQ, before you understand anything about materials, just getting an indication of what your infrastructure carbon emissions are.
So that's great. Yeah, I think we've all had experience and we recognise proportionality is key to this. And as I said, we can't just be doing carbon quantification and management on the big, just on major projects. You know, there's this whole body of transport infrastructure, small maintenance projects, small schemes across the UK. Proportionality is key if we're going to start thinking about carbon in that, and benchmarks that Liv's described, I think, can really help us achieve that proportionality when it comes to carbon assessment. That really quick, simple, what's the length of your cycle lane, it instantly gives you that estimate of the potential carbon, which yeah, can be really invaluable, particularly at early stages. So I think that's all our questions. So we're going to wrap up there. But yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for joining today. Really appreciate you dialing in. So yeah, thank you.